So then, talk about how you're viewing the Black Lives Matter uprisings of 2020 in South Africa. And I just want to put like a couple of ideas out because I specifically want to know your thoughts on them. So one, and there's one that's very pessimistic, and one that I would say is actually, and I hope is true because it's incredible, which your colleague Sean Jacobs, that Anna and I who Anna and I interviewed on Weekends this past Saturday, which I recommend everybody go watch over on the Jacobin channel. But Alex Huckley is a really interesting piece in Damage, which again, I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but I think it's a great overall critique and a check on this idea that the replications of protests, particularly in Europe, it's really just an expression of kind of American soft power and branding. So you have places where, very specifically, let's just say so the police violence is actually targeted at very specifically, say, like the Roma population. And there isn't anything, like there's no rhetoric about the racism to do with Roma. There's no context of it. It's literally a replication of what you see in the United States. Is this very, and then, I think obviously in other places like the UK, it's much more complicated, but this is a very interesting critique and a very important one. And then, of course and then as soon as it spins off into the whole, white fragility book, it's like, oh God, is that going to get translated into Danish, Jesus, and all of a sudden the whole kind of just absolutely kind of embarrassing disaster of it all. On the flip side, Sean Jacobs, editor at Africa as a Country, has actually compared the 2014 uprisings and emergence of Black Lives Matter after the murder and events in Ferguson as one of obviously many, many, many examples, as in 1996 Soweto uprising. And now, 4 years later, he actually compares it to United Democratic Front, which was seminal in dismantling apartheid in the 1980s. I mean, that's an incredibly optimistic read of the possibility of this movement. And it seems to me, though, that the irony is that if Sean Jacobs' version is going to be right, we have to fight to make it right. America needs to get infinitely less insular, because the class dimension that you're pointing to could probably be best understood through South Africa. And it's not on the map as we shift to, Gone with the Wind is off TV, a new round of terrorizing people on Twitter, and all of a sudden, all of the, very serious dismantling racist, terroristic policing at the intersection of white supremacy and capital, falls to the background.
Yeah, I think Sean's comparison to the United Democratic Front is interesting, but I've expressed it to him that I'm skeptical of what's happening now and what happened with the United Democratic Front being analogous. And I think, the reason why I'm skeptical is that I think that the formation of the United Democratic Front emerged as a mobilization towards a very clear and definitive goal that had a precedent of long-standing mobilization, right, which was ending apartheid. And that's simple, and that's clear, and that's straightforward. Whereas I think the mobilization that's happening now, I think as much as it's starting to crystallize into very specific goals, such as defunding and democratizing the police, the vision for structural transformation is more unclear, right? In the 1980s, when the United Democratic Front was formed, the vision for structural transformation was extending political franchise to Black, colored, and Indian South Africans, right? But now, I think that the vision for structural transformation that the Black Lives Matter movement has to start naming and moving towards is one of the fundamental transformation of America's political economy, right? So it has to become anti-capitalist in orientation. And I think that's the direction that it has to go towards. And it's hard to tell at the moment whether or not that will be the case, and what does it hinge on for it to start to trot in that direction.
Yeah. Do you feel a particular, because again, America is just, even when we're being, finally acknowledging the depth of racism in this country and sort of starting to adopt certain neoliberal or woke discourses or whatever, we are so damn insular. And I'm just curious, very specifically, when you think about the strategic orientation of where things can go, and including this kind of anti-capitalist and public goods framework, do you have a specific thought of a lesson for the United States when you take, again, leaders like Ramaphosa and Mbeki, that I will say from a US perspective, whatever damage they have caused in office or in Ramaphosa's business career, maybe you'll talk about Maracana. I mean, these guys are still just definitionally more impressive than almost anybody on the American political scene. I mean, honestly, Zuma too. Honestly, these are people who have accomplished real things at enormous physical risk and produced a vital and necessary change that still inspires the world. And then actually not much with regards to the working, to the poor, to structural change, to uprooting all of the legacies of apartheid. And so, I just wonder if there's a way of, translating that to the relevant lesson here for the United States and the globe.
Yeah. I think for me, sort of like the case of Ramaphosa and Mbeki, I think can be instructive to the rest of the globe in demonstrating, I think, the pitfalls of, some strains of racial identity politics, right? Which is to say that I think that, you're right. And I have to give proper acknowledgement to the tremendous accomplishments of the African National Congress and the fact that it has delivered a lot of substantial gains for South Africa's poor. But having said that, I think that what we're witnessing in South Africa now is the discrediting of the national liberation movement, which is this idea that if you elect Black people to high political office, then they will be well placed to deliver political gains that translate to the lowest rungs of that society. And what Ramaphosa and Mbeki specifically, I think, embody is that national liberation current, and specifically one that, after the embrace of neoliberal orthodoxy, promoted this idea that all South Africa needs for socio-economic transformation is to encourage the emergence of a patriotic bourgeoisie, expand the Black middle class, and then this will deliver economic gains that trickle down to poor South Africans. And it's been demonstrably untrue. That hasn't happened. As much as, poor South Africans have access to important basic services, that's just been the absolute minimum provision for them. And this national liberation politics, which has sort of been the highest expression of South Africa's political imagination and ambitions, is proving an unstable and unworthy and illegitimate form of delivering socioeconomic transformation for the majority of South Africans. And I think that's probably how I think it could be instructive for the American case, which is to say that if we don't, and this is, I guess, what I was also trying to emphasize in my piece, is that if we don't emphasize how there are class distinctions between Black people as well, then you're going to get trapped once again in a political mode which posits the homogenous interests of Black people. And then when some Black people are able to be in positions of enormous power, you're going to be disappointed because you're going to discover that in fact there are contradictory interests, class interests within amongst Black people. And I think that's probably the most instructive the South African case is, or what it's most instructive of, rather.
Yeah, and again, this just leads us always back to Adolf Reed. So, and Vivek Chibber was talking about this too, like the just sort of the relentless middle classness of it all. And so, do you see that sort of one-to-one of, the different poles that the rhetoric goes, like people are in the street because of racism, police violence, police fatal violence, and then how it overlaps with class, and then a conversation that goes to, we need to deal with that, and then we need to deal with the corresponding issues of capitalism, and then, especially in mainstream discourses, it just completely turns to, you see like the notification on the phones. And again, it's not a question, of course, yes, like, or obviously diversity in organizations and so on is important, but you can see the just kind of rapid change from any of the radical policy implications for policing and connected issues to the same, we'll have this ongoing brutal inequity, but we'll change some of the composition at the top.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the direction that I see it going in. And I think what I would say is that it presents a challenge for the American left, which is to say that I think that it was inevitable that this was going to be co-opted, and we shouldn't be surprised that it's being co-opted.
Right.
What the American left rather has to guard against is embracing some of the ways of understanding and explaining the problem, which is now starting to enter mainstream discourses and sort of pacify the radical potential of this movement. And I think that in order to do that, it continuously has to sort of emphasize the class dynamic and the class character of all of these issues, right? That just seems to me like a very obvious thing that it has to do. And it shouldn't.
And you get accused of distraction. I mean, this is how ridiculous the debate can get in the United States, because it's like, you have this incredible, and I wonder if there's parallels in South Africa too, where it's like, okay, so the only people that would, all lives matter, whatever. Like, there's a big contingent of reactionary racist and, politics in the United States. Okay, so set that. That's very clearly in political conflict. And then you, although even there, bizarrely on the superficial end, like, the Republicans and Donald Trump feel a need to fake police reform, like, we're no more chokeholds. I mean, unless your life is in danger. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's insulting. And they literally gas protesters at the same time. But you can move the cultural dial enough where even Mitch McConnell will pretend that he needs to pretend to care about, feel he needs to pretend to care about police brutality. And then but then in this conversation, it's like, okay, so this is happening. This is absolutely unacceptable, and it needs to be a site, a launching point for all of these issues of class and distribution and race. And then it becomes, oh, well, you're distracting from it. And I'm just, and then it's fascinating because it sounds very like, wait, I certainly don't want to be distracting from it. But then it's like, wait a second, the conversation that sounds the most sort of like specific and radical all of a sudden is ricocheting into the same conversation that has to do with, like CNN having more, different executives or whatever, which again, sure, great, they should, but that's not what this is about.
Yeah, I mean, exactly that. And it's perplexing to me as to why it would ever be portrayed as a distraction, because if one thinks of a lot of what this movement seeks to accomplish, right? Defunding the police, democratizing the police, demilitarizing the police, and in the most radical iterations, abolishing the police in its entirety.
Right.
And there's a separate conversation about whether or not that is politically desirable or feasible or whatever. But if you think about what this movement hopes to accomplish, none of this is going to be possible unless you have a transformation of the fundamental political economy of the United States. And none of it is going to be possible unless you build political power that puts you in a position to have the capacity to implement all of this stuff in the first place, right?
Right.
And if the conversation enters that territory, then it becomes a matter of, how do we get there? How do we build a resilient movement that is able of implementing the things that we want? And if you're on the left, the way you build that movement is by waging class struggle. So it's I don't know, it's perplexing, as I said, to me, to see why amongst the left this would be viewed as a distraction, when I understand that as being the definitive quality of being on the left, or at least I guess the socialist left. And maybe the left is become something that is much more expansive of different political tendencies than it once was. But that's my understanding of it.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.